No more muffins.
Okay, I think we are ready to go now.
All right, my friend.
We are now streaming.
Morning Transportation Advisory Committee, virtual meeting, remote meeting via Zoom conference call. Per the RSA 91-A:2, Roman numeral 3B, the RPC chair has declared the COVID-19 outbreak an emergency and has waived the requirement that a quorum be physically present at the meeting. We're going to do the introductions, and somebody going to do the minutes afterwards.
So what I think we'll do is we'll do sort of just a quick intro thing here, and then we'll do introductions and sort of do accept the minutes, all at once, so that we can limit our numbers of times that because of doing roll call, because we have 2 other roll call votes that we're going to need to do. Just trying to limit the amount of time that we spend doing all of those different kind of things.
And talking.
So first thing, I think just before, everybody's pretty comfortable with Zoom at this point, or being online. Just one thing to just help Annette with doing the minutes would be if you make a motion or a second, just say your name along with it, so that Annette can know who is doing that. Otherwise, I think we're pretty well good to go. We do things fairly informally. If you've got your screen up and you need to say something, you can either wave your hands or do the raise hand button, which is at the I believe it's at the bottom of the participants list. And so other than that, does anybody have any questions or concerns about any of that? No. All right.
I had just one question. You mentioned that there's a button to push to raise your hand. I can't see that on my screen. Can you give me a little help?
Yeah, where is that? I can never.
I think that depends on which version of Zoom you have.
Okay.
Go to reactions. Go to reactions, and on the bottom of that says raise hand.
Reactions.
Reactions.
Sorry, I don't have that.
If you have an older version of Zoom, you don't have the raise hand function.
Okay. I'll just
Raise
put
your hand in front of the camera.
Yeah.
that will work.
Yep. So, okay.
David, I wanted to ask that if everybody says a motion, please raise your hand so everybody can see it.
Okay.
Sometimes you can't.
That's a good addition there. All right. So Richard, did you already do the spiel at the beginning of the remote meeting?
I
Okay.
did. Too.
Excellent. Sort of lost track where we were here. All right. So I guess minutes of the January meeting are next.
Yep. Do we have a motion?
So moved. Ken Lancho.
Do we have a second?
I'll second Rod Nichols.
Okay, go ahead,
Right.
David. Roll call.
Okay. I'm going to go in the order that I have people written down. So hopefully I can do that. And if I've been adding people as they join. So Bob Landman.
Present, but that I wasn't at the January meeting, so I don't vote on that meeting.
You're going to abstain?
That's the word I was looking for. Been a while.
It's early, Bob. Juliet Walker.
Present, and I'm at my home office. Nobody else in the room.
Okay. Are you voting to approve the minutes?
And I approved the minutes. Sorry about that.
All right. Thank you. Mark Connors.
Yes, I approve the minutes.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Is Mike Whitten here? Nope. Okay. Chris Jacobs is also not here. People who said they were coming and haven't showed up yet. Richard McDermott.
Here and home alone, and I approve.
All right. Thank you. Tim White.
Tim White, New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, home alone, and I vote to approve the minutes.
All right. Thank you, Tim. Lucy St. John. Oh, you're muted, Lucy. Oh.
You there?
Yeah, there we are.
Oh, okay,
All
there
right.
it is. I'm sorry. I abstain and I'm home alone.
All right, thanks. Staying, Paul Maloney from Federal Highways. No, you're a non-voting member, but I see that you're here.
Morning, present and abstain. Thank you. Home alone,
Matt
is that important to this meeting? I'm sorry to interrupt you, Dave. Is that important?
No, that's all right. You know, I think it seems to be a thing that's done. I'm not, I
Okay.
don't like it's critical, but I guess it's to ensure that nobody is being coerced by their votes. And you know, we know how important the TAC is. And so, you know, I wouldn't be surprised, you know, if there's people off screen. Okay, Matt Scruton.
Matt Scruton, present. I vote yes, and nobody has influenced my vote.
All right, thank you, Matt. Danya Siegley.
Present from Rye, home alone, and I approve the minutes.
All right, thank you. Rad Nichols.
Hold on, let me check with my wife how I should vote. I am the only one in the room. Home. I vote aye.
All right, thank you, Rad. Peter Coffin.
Home, present, alone, and I vote yes.
All right, thank you, Peter. Ken Latchaw.
Yes, I vote yes for the minutes. My wife is here, but she is not bending my arm.
All right, that's good. Beverly Cray.
I am here, UNH. I'm in my office alone and I abstain.
All right, thank you, Beverly. And then last but not least, I see Tim Moore has joined us. Tim, we're doing the minutes.
Yep, I'm home alone and I approve the minutes.
All right, thank you, Tim. Okay. On to the
next
next
on the
thing.
agenda, 2021-24 Transportation Improvement Program updated 2045.
All right, so I am going to share my screen.
Are you going to be the first and then Scott?
You know, it's Scott and I talked about this last night a little bit. I think I'm going to handle sort of the bulk of things all the way through with Scott interjecting at different places along the way where it makes sense. And you know, because it's essentially the Dave show today, I made one giant PowerPoint for everybody's entertainment. And I'm going to share that. Yeah, well, you know, I wouldn't want you guys to be bored.
You've been doing this too long.
All right, so can everybody see the presentation that's up there, Transportation Improvement Program and Long Range Transportation Plan?
Yep.
All right.
Heading.
All right, hold on one second as I get myself set here. Okay, so I'm going to go into a little bit about kind of background stuff before I dig into the specifics of the tip and then the plan. And then the next item on the agenda is actually the 10-year plan. So we're kind of hitting all the big documents that we sort of deal with on a sort of a cyclical nature, and everything is sort of coming due at once here. And so you know, we're just going to talk about some big picture stuff first before I dive into the details. So, okay, first thing, I just, you know, getting some of these acronyms out of the way. I'm going to probably use them throughout the meeting. And so just wanted to make sure everybody's aware of what all of them mean. They're just listed in alphabetical order here. CMAQ is the Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Program. DES, Department of Environmental Services. I didn't include NHDOT on here because I feel like that's we sort of know that one pretty well. Federal Highways, the FHWA, FTAs, Federal Transit Administration, GASIT, Governor's Advisory Commission on Intermodal Transportation. That is essentially the Governor's Council plus the Commissioner of the DOT. HSIP, that's a Highway Safety Improvement Program. LRTP, sometimes also known as the MTP or Metropolitan Transportation Plan. That's our long range transportation plan for the region. The STIP is the State Transportation Improvement Program, which we'll be spending some time talking about as well. TA or TAP, that's the Transportation Alternatives Program. For those of you that have been around a while, it used to be known as the Transportation Enhancements Program. And the TIP is the Transportation Improvement Program. That's our short range list of projects. And then the TYP is the State 10-Year Plan, sort of one of our guiding documents here. So talking about where we are at this moment, we are in the midst of a 30-day comment period that began earlier here in February and will conclude on March 9th. There'll be a public hearing at the MPO meeting on the 10th, and at that public meeting, we'll be discussing the TIP and the plan, and hopefully adopting both of those documents. And then, of course, once all of the TIPs are approved around the state, they become the STIP, and that gets submitted for federal approval by the Federal Highway Administration and Federal Transit Administration. And the big issue that we have, or not issue, I guess, the big concern that we have is that we make sure that our Metropolitan TIP and long range transportation plan are consistent in that the projects are shown sort of in similar cost and timeframes when they're in both documents. You can actually, there is a public engagement portal up on our public input website that you can make comments on the TIP and the long range plan. You can find that at publicinput.com/2021TIP. And you can put any comments you have in there, as well as, of course, make them at this meeting or at the public hearing on the 10th. So going back a little bit to sort of some of the big picture stuff here. So we have really 3 guiding documents that are the bulk of the transportation planning process here in New Hampshire. We have our Metropolitan Long Range Transportation Plan, which is a 20+ year document that we update on sort of a 4 to 5 year cycle. And it's really, that's the big picture. It has our goals and our objectives for the region. We talk about our vision for the future, currently goes to 2045. So we're looking out 20 or 25 years into the future. And from that, we draw our candidate projects for the state 10-year plan. Now, the state 10-year plan, that's a state-run process. It's cyclical every 2 years. That is essentially the state's commitment to funding a project. Projects on that list are required to be fiscally constrained by state law, and it's sort of a mix of federal and state funded projects. And as projects enter the 10-year plan, they generally enter at the outer years and move forward in time as they get closer. And within the 10-year plan, the regions have been sort of given a sort of a set of target funding amount to set our priority projects for that funding. Now, within the 10-year plan, and it ends up making up the first 4 years of the 10-year plan, is the MPO TIP. And this is a federally required document, and it's an MPO document as opposed to a state document. And it's the first 4 years. It's updated every 2 years. It is we are required to include any project that has federal funding or is considered to be regionally significant. So something like a turnpike project, which is using state dollars from the turnpike, but is on I-95 or something like that, that would be considered regionally significant, and we would need to include that. We have to have everything be fiscally constrained in that we aren't planning to spend more money than we expect to have on projects. This is where any project that's being designed or implemented is listed in the TIP. So, and then again, as I said a few minutes ago, all the regional TIPs are combined to create the state TIP. So long range transportation plan process, we sort of update that on a 4-year cycle-ish. By law, I guess now because we're in we're no longer a non-attainment area for air quality conformity purposes. We could actually go every 5 years and update. But we sort of update the long range plan kind of in 2 pieces. On a 4-year cycle, we look at updating all the existing conditions data, the goals and objectives, looking at our new planning factors and that kind of thing, and doing that major sort of deep dive into the document and making major revisions. On a 2-year cycle, we look at the system performance and the project list to make sure that it's consistent with what's being proposed in the TIP and the 10-year plan. So essentially, the green circles here are the stuff that we update on a 4-year cycle, 4 to 5 year cycle. And in the blue is the items that we work on every couple of years as part of the 10-year plan cycle. So similarly, the 10-year plan cycle, that is a 2-year cycle. We're involved kind of at the beginning and at the end of that process. And then, and this is more established in state law in terms of the timing, but during odd years, we work on identifying projects and prioritizing those for the 10-year plan, and DOT works on developing a draft 10-year plan. And then there's, in the fall of the odd years, there's the GASSET hearings and review of the plan, and sometimes there's multiple drafts developed for that. Once the GASSET has approved it, then it goes to the governor for review and any changes he might make. And then the legislature, once he's approved it, or I guess he makes any changes and then sends it to the legislature for review. And they make any changes that they feel are necessary. And it gets eventually it gets signed into law by the governor, usually in early to midsummer on even number years. And from that, we take the first 4 years and start developing the STIP and the TIPs. So, we get into that. And so we get to the point where we're at number 10 here right now, sort of. This is a little later than what the usual cycle is, but, we're well within our timing. So, but what that has done is essentially we're overlapping items 10 and 1 here. So we're approving the current TIP or the new TIP while we're talking about the next cycle of the 10-year plan already. So we're kind of compressing the circle a little bit. So our role in the 10-year plan is to identify transportation project priorities mostly. We provide feedback to DOT on the drafts. We provide input to the GASSET. That's District 3 is our entire region is within District 3. And so that our new executive counselor is Janet Stevens. And so we'll be working with her on providing input to the 10-year plan. And we also participate in those hearings directly and making presentations on our process and the projects and the discussions that we have with the communities. So, and then sort of that's all takes place at the beginning of the cycle. And then of course, at the end of the cycle, we are in charge of drafting our own TIP for our region. And so we review the draft state TIP and provide comments to DOT. And then we pull the regional TIP out of that and pull that together and then develop the plan and the TIP for the public hearings and adoption. So, so kind of how those two different cycles overlap is that the projects that are in our adopted long-range plan form the basis of the projects that we propose for the state 10-year plan. So we take all those projects in our long-range plan and we prioritize them and say, okay, out of all our projects in our long-range plan, these are our top priorities for the 10-year plan. So, and then on the other end of the cycle, as we're drafting, once the 10-year plan has kind of come together and we're drafting the TIP document, we then take that information and that gets pulled back into the long-range plan to ensure that the projects are listed consistently between the 3 documents, so that if you look at the TIP, you're going to see the same information on a project as you would see in the 10-year plan or the long-range plan for those same 4 years. So, okay, so now that's sort of covered the big picture kind of piece. I'm going to talk about the transportation improvement program specifically for the 21 to 24 fiscal years. Maybe I'll just take a second. Does anybody have any questions or comments on what I've gone over so far?
Can we get copies of those, David?
Copies of the documents or the presentation?
The colorful presentation.
Oh, of course. I'll put the presentation up on the website and link everybody to that. We'll also have a project updates memo that we'll put out and we'll put that up there as well. So.
Thanks. Thank you.
So, okay. All right, I'm going to plunge forward. So getting into the specifics of the 21 to 24 Transportation Improvement Program. So the TIP builds off, as I said, the 10-year plan that was signed by the governor. It incorporates both information on projects that are already in the midst of design or construction, as well as anything new that's coming into that 21 to 24 timeframe from the 10-year plan. So we essentially, when we do a new TIP, we drop the first 2 years off the existing TIP and add 2 new years to the end. So it's a pretty straightforward process that way. And as I said, it becomes the first 4 years of our long range plan. The fiscal constraint requirements that we have are more stringent than they are for the TIP, for the long range plan or the state tenure plan. We have to demonstrate that we are fiscally constrained by fiscal year and by funding program. So it's a little bit more detail than what we have to do at the plan level, which is basically ensuring that we're fiscally constrained by fiscal year. So what's included in this update? So we're updating all our project listings, and any information, cost, and timing essentially are for the most part are things that are changing. We are ensuring that our fiscal constraint documentation is up to date and that it is consistent with the guidance that we're receiving from Federal Highway Administration and DOT on what needs to be included in that. We are updating our public involvement section. We updated the public participation plan last fall, maybe was it? Yeah, last fall. And so to include some of the more virtual work that we're doing now, and we updated our public involvement section to reflect that as well. We updated the system performance report. This is basically looking at all the performance measures and targets that we've talked about over the last few years. That gets all pulled together into a single, essentially an appendix to our TIP that talks about what the performance measures are, what our targets are, and how the TIP helps us make progress towards achieving those targets. So, and then of course there are technical updates to other pieces throughout the document, here and there. So one of the pieces that's included in the TIP each cycle is a look back at the previous iteration to see how we've done in terms of implementing projects. So in the previous TIP, there were 24 projects that were scheduled. And so we look at the years that are dropping out of the new TIP and see what projects in those 2 years sort of moved forward as scheduled. So for the years 2019 and 2020 from the current TIP, we had 24 projects listed as going to construction at that point. Out of that, 11 of those 24 are were completed or are in the process of being completed at this point. And that's slightly less than 50%, but it's the bulk of the funding that we saw during those 2 years. And there's some major, very large projects included in that. And then there were 12 projects that were delayed or pushed out from their original scope and timing to be 21 or 22 or even later in some cases. And that's only about 26% of the funding, though, even though it's 50% of the projects. And there was one small project that was a planning project that DOT was going to do that was dropped as not being needed. So that just one project dropped out of the TIP.
Dave, this is Paul. Can I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
The delayed projects, although you noted large in number, but not so large in dollar figures, is there a common theme as to why those projects that were delayed? Needs changing or additional information necessary, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of them tend to be the smaller projects that are more locally driven. So I think there's more time sometimes needed to get through the federal process and to get everything organized and ready to go to construction. But I think I include the list here, and we can in the next slide here. So we can sort of go through them and see what they are. I wasn't intending to go through all of these. This is the list of projects that were completed or sort of in progress.
I don't want to take I don't want to take you off your presentation. I was just curious about that.
Yep.
That's okay. Thank you.
Yep. The next slide includes the list of those that were delayed too. So we'll just touch on that a little bit. You can see the list of projects here that were completed or are in progress. Newington Dover being probably the biggest here at 70 million, the main portion of that turnpike project. The Sarah Long Bridge. Actually, that's the high level bridge that's in progress. That's the I-95 bridge on over the Piscataqua. That's at 33 million. Substantial work on I-93 in the Salem to Manchester project, sort of the widening to the fourth lane or the paving of the fourth lane, as well as the work down by the state line. So those are sort of the big pieces there. When we look at the projects that were delayed or discontinued, for the most part, these are smaller projects, with the exception of the Spalding Turnpike. That's the General Sullivan Bridge rehabilitation replacement. And so that we all know that that's been sort of slowed down a little bit as they tried to figure out the best approach to addressing that structure and maintaining that bike pedestrian connection across the Little Bay there. So that was delayed out till 2024. And that's a $33 million project at this point. Don't know what the exact outcome will be on that. For the rest of it, for the most part, these are smaller projects. In many cases, these are related to the Transportation Alternatives or CMAQ program, or in some cases, HSIP program. Just a variety here that we. And I know, I'll touch on one other project, this Newcastle Rye 1B project, that bridge replacement. That project was delayed specifically to allow that bridge is one of the two remaining bascule bridges, movable bridges in the state. The other one being the Hampton Seabrook Bridge on Route 1A. Both of which are up for replacement. And so they delayed the construction on this project in order to complete the environmental and historic resources work on the Seabrook Hampton project, so that if a decision needs to be made that they need to keep one bascule bridge, they can have both to choose from to see which one might be the most appropriate to keep. So they're holding off on the construction of that until the Hampton Seabrook is further along. Juliet, I see that you raised your hand.
Just a quick comment. I mean, on the delays, all of the Portsmouth projects actually have gone through a design phase. They're just the final engineering is slightly delayed, and I think a lot of them, it's partly just COVID was one influence, and also just as you get further into the process, sometimes right away and other issues come up and create. But I know, for example, all the Portsmouth projects are in process. They're just delayed on construction.
All right, thank you for that. Yeah, I didn't bring that up, but that's a great point. COVID has slowed everything down, so that I'm sure is coming into play across the board here as well. All right. Looking at our projects specifically in our 21 to 24 tip, we have 42 projects or contracts that are around the region, totaling about $237 million. Includes our transit systems that are funded. Those are funded as group projects instead of individual listings as they were before. And then there are also 34 statewide programs, and these are groupings of similar types of projects that don't have to be listed individually in the tip. Things like all the paving projects in the region, bridge maintenance work and things like that. So there are 34 of those programs that the state has put together, and those total about $345 million, of which a portion of that we would expect to be spent in our region, but that's going to vary somewhat from year to year. So when we look at the funding and break it down, about 72% of our funding is federal funding. And on the state side, that equates to about 23%, and that is largely on the turnpike side. The state funds and matches the federal funding on the federally funded projects with toll credits, which are the, basically, I always struggle to define this. So every dollar that the state spends on maintaining and improving the turnpike system can be used as a match towards federally funded projects off the turnpike system. And so that's what occurs in New Hampshire for the most part, with most of the federally funded projects being matched with toll credits. So they're essentially 100% federally funded. And then the remaining sort of local other piece of this is the local funding, local match for some of those smaller local projects, as well as for the transit systems in the region, and things like that. And that equates to about 4.5% of our total funding. You can see it's broken down by year here. We're fairly equal across the 4 years, ranging between 53 and 63 million. In terms of total projects each year. When we break it down by phase, the large part, again, as expected, would be in construction. That's about 63% of the funding is going towards construction, 10% towards right-of-way, 6% towards engineering work. And then that other is about 20%. That is essentially transit work, the transit grants, as well as a little bit of planning kind of work. So looking at the tip specifically, our 5 largest projects in terms of cost, at least, are the replacement of the 1A bridge over Hampton Harbor. That's the Seabrook-Hampton project. That's $21 million in the tip, but a total project cost of just under $64 million at this point. I-93 debt service is our second largest project, and that's $20 million, almost $21 million going towards that over the course of the next 4 years. Total debt service for that project is just under $50 million. Sarah Long Bridge still has some work going on, and this is work that's happening primarily around the port and also on the main side of things in terms of improving some of the access and the right of way down on that end. There's still almost $16 million in the tip for that project. And that total project cost on that bridge replacement was $225 million, which with about 50% of that being paid for by the state of Maine. General Sullivan Bridge replacement or rehabilitation, or whatever the combination of those two things that might end up as, that's about $14 million in the tip, with a total project cost of just under $33 million. And then the 5th sort of largest project is Plasto Kingston 125. This is the work that's going to happen sort of straddling the borders of those two communities, between the work that was done up to Old County Road in Plasto and the Newton Junction Road intersection in Kingston. And that is the last component of that corridor study was finished in 1999, and projects started getting implemented at that point. So it's taken just over 20 years to get that fully implemented. And that's about $14 million at this point. Total cost about $16 million. So that's about 40% of our total funding in the tip goes to these 4 projects, which is actually significantly less than what we've had in most more recent cycles. We've had a lot of very large projects between the 93 widening, the Spalding Turnpike, and the Sarah Long Bridge, and before that the Memorial Bridge. And so these large projects have taken upwards of 50 to 60% of our tip funding in previous years. So we're actually seeing that declining.
But David, I got a question.
Certainly.
About the General Sullivan Bridge. Since I've been out of this for a couple of years, when I asked if you're going to rehabilitate it, I said, so you're going to have a maintenance plan, because it's a steel bridge and it needs maintenance. I mean, where I come from anyway, the Golden Gate Bridge and the San Francisco Bay Bridge. What's going on with that? Are they really going to try and restore that thing, or the Coast Guard just get it out of the way? It's a hazard to navigation, blow it up. My preference.
Yeah. Scott might have some updated information that I'm not aware of. But my understanding is that they're going to tear down parts of it and keep parts of it. But I think that's still in flux because you're right. The steel structure is problematic in that saltwater environment.
Yep.
But my understanding was that there are components or maybe even design elements that they want to keep to sort of maintain that, to sort of keep some of that historic look, but make it out of a maybe more concrete, less steel. So I don't know, Scott, do you have any?
Last I knew, they were going through sort of a new alternatives analysis for that, with full restoration being one of the options being, as Dave said, replacing part of it, but keeping that truss structure. Another option being just removing the entire steel superstructure, keeping the footings, the existing concrete footings, which are in good shape, and rebuilding a new steel superstructure on top of that would be better designed for weather resistance and long-term maintenance. And I think that the department's in negotiation with the Division of Historic Resources on that.
All right. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, Scott.
All right. So moving along, the transit system funding, and I may ask Scott to chime in on this as well. So in the last iteration of the TIP, we started to we changed how transit projects were listed in the document, and so they're grouped by agency and funding source. So as Coast's primary funding and primary consistent funding is through the FTA 5307 program. So they have a single listing with all of their funding in that, and that's about 11 million. MTA is included in that's a Manchester Transit Authority. So the CART system in the western part of our region was absorbed into MTA a couple of years ago now, and so all the CART funding is included in this Manchester Transit Authority funding as well. And there's 3 different pieces of that funding. The 5307, of course, for the small urban system, but also the 5310 funding for the seniors and individuals with disabilities that CART gets, but now part of MTA, and the 5339, which is for funding for vehicles and equipment. So those are listed individually, and then we also have the Boston Urbanized Area 5307 funds, which is primarily used for to fund the intercity service. That's on 993. But there are other uses for that as well. So we're totaling about 48.5 million in transit funding over the next 4 years. So Scott, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
As the note at the bottom includes, I think this does not include the section 5310 funds that both CART and Coast receive through the state that support the work of the RCCs and the supplemental funding for seniors and folks with disabilities. The 5310 and 5339 funds that you see here under MTA are actually funds that come directly to CART and now CART and MTA through the Nashua Urbanized Area.
Great, thanks, Scott. Rad, I saw you had raised your hand.
Yeah, Dave, I sent an email to Fred Butler while I was reviewing all these numbers this morning because I'm not sure I can make them add up to what I had last submitted to DOT. So
okay,
an FYI.
All right. That's something we have time to work on.
Yep.
So, all right, thank you. Okay, so I'm not going to list through all these. There are a number of other projects in the region that are in the TIP. I'm just going to hit the highlights here, which are some of the newer projects coming in. For the most part, these are coming in through the 10-year plan process, like this Hampstead 121 Dairy Road Depot Road intersection that was added to the 10-year plan, I think 3 cycles ago, and it's now hit the point where we're starting to see some pieces of it added to the TIP. Hampton US 1 bridge over the Pan Am Railroad. This is the bridge over on Route 1, right at the Northampton town line, or the railroad there. And that was added through the Red List Bridge program.
What are they going to do with that? What's the plan?
I don't, it's pretty early yet. It says rehabilitation, I believe. You know, but I don't know the details of exactly what that means.
It's pretty tight there. You've got a very narrow lanes, you know, with the, you know, you keep wondering, is there going to be accidents there? I mean, it's just, it's creepy. Every time I go over it, I just, you know, it narrows so much. You got a left turn to go up Post Road where I live. It's just weird. It's weird.
Yeah. I don't know what the plan is specifically for that project. I can look into what the estimate says that they're planning to do, but off the top of my head, I'm not sure. Newcastle Rye, this is some bike pedestrian work on Route 1A and 1B. That's coming down through the 10-year plan that was added 3 cycles ago. Newton Pond Street Bridge rehab, that was coming through the 10-year plan, but it's also a red list bridge. Plasto 125 signal coordination. This is also coming through the 10-year plan that was added, I think, 3 cycles ago. In Portsmouth, we have a couple of projects on the Pease Development Authority. First, putting a right turn lane at intersection New Hampshire Ave and Arboretum. That was funded via CMAQ, as was some electrical vehicle charging stations via CMAQ. We have some Market Street railroad crossing improvements, and this was added through the state's, one of the state's railroad, railroad crossing statewide programmatic, but they get pulled out for individual projects in some cases. In Salem, there's a signal operation and coordination improvement project that was funded via the CMAQ program, and also extension of their bike path along the abandoned rail line there. That was also funded through CMAQ. I've highlighted this Salem Depot expansion in green. My understanding is this dropped out of the tip, but it still should be in there. So I expect that if it's not included in the final version as we go for approval here at the policy committee meeting next month, it'll be included in the first amendment going forward, because there was, it's still listed for this time frame. They've gone to bid on it, but it hasn't started construction. So, I think it still needs to be listed. It's just, there was some sort of a mix up there in the development of the tip or the step. When we look at the programmatic project specifically, like I said, there are 34 statewide programs, about $350 million worth of funding. These are projects that don't need to be listed individually in the tip. And so they're sort of holding pots of money for various types of things. I'm not going to go into what each of these are, as that would take entirely too much time, but it's largely maintenance and preservation type work. Some of the major programs like the TA program that I mentioned earlier, the CMAQ program, the HSIP program is included in here. As long as they're only using federal funding, they can stay in here. If they start to bring in some local funding or state funding, they need to be pulled out into an individual project in the tip. And that's why you sometimes see like the railroad crossing project at Market Street must have some state or local funding in it. So it got pulled out as an individual project. So when we look at the statewide project summary in terms of the funding, again, the bulk of that funding is federal, about 88% of it, as we would expect. So just over 300 million, another 28 million, almost 29 million in state funding, and then a little bit of local match funding is included in that as well. And this is largely, again, the match funding that goes to the transit projects, and some matching of smaller like TA and CMAQ project type things from local communities. And then by phase, the bulk again is in construction, about 78% of it, 270 million-ish. And then with a little bit in engineering and right-of-way, and 18% in other. And again, this is largely the statewide transit projects and that kind of thing. These grouped statewide programs that don't do construction or aren't involved directly in construction. So diving into those statewide programs, these are not projects that we have to list individually in the tip. And so we don't. And so, but these are the sort of examples of the types of things that you're going to see in that. You're seeing some paving, drainage rehabs, some of the smaller bridge rehabs or replacements, culvert work, things like that. Some of it is even construction, like salted wells, where DOT has to address private wells that have been impacted from road salt, basically intrusion kind of things. So, and it's sort of things like replacing high mast lighting on I-95, that kind of stuff. So just as some examples of that type of work. And they range from very small projects to pretty substantial, millions of dollars.
The 151, 111, what's going to happen with that? That's really...
Okay. That's just some interim work there, based on the fatal crash that occurred last year. DOT is looking at making some interim improvements to try to reduce the likelihood of that type of crash happening again in the future.
It's so confusing. It's a terrible intersection.
Yeah, I mean, there's not going to be some significant changes. It's really the western approach of 111 to 151. They're going to bring it into a single T instead of a split approach. That's the short term. Long term, we're looking at funding through the HSIP program, a broader set of improvements, but that'll take a bit.
There were some UNH students that had studied that. Is that being considered?
That's being used as sort of the starting point of the design, the longer term design work. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. So we've had a comment period open now for a couple weeks, maybe close to 3 weeks now. We've had 28 views of our public engagement portal, but no comments made to date. I did get a note from Tim White on a technical adjustment that we need to make as part of the air quality conformity piece. But we're continuing to review the project list and the financials to ensure that everything is listed accuracy. And it sounds like I've got some work to do with Coast on making sure that those are listed appropriately, their projects. And then, of course, we're waiting feedback from NHDOT, Federal Highways, and FTA, who usually provide, to some degree, some direct comments on our tip. Speaking of Federal Highways, our friend Lee Levine just joined. And so, we're still in the midst of the comment period. So I would expect, we'll get a few more views. We may get a comment or two. Members of the TAC, absolutely. If you have specific comments you want to lodge about the tip or the plan, go to the public input website that I listed earlier in the presentation. And I believe I may have put that on the agenda. I'm not sure. I guess I did not. I'm sorry. No. Or maybe it's in the memo on the tip and the plan. Go to that website and you can put in any comments that you might have about projects or about any components of the document. So, well, I'm going to ask to hold off on a motion and until after we talk about the long range plan, so that we only have to do one roll call vote on it. Sure. What I'm going to be looking for today is a recommendation from the TAC to approve the 21, or to the policy committee to approve the 21 to 24 tip. And basing that recommendation on the fact that the tip and the plan are both fiscally constrained, that they reflect regional priorities. We've addressed our transportation conformity requirements, and we make progress towards achieving our regional performance targets. So maybe before I move on to talking about the plan, and does anybody have any additional questions on the tip?
Well done.
Thanks. It's a lot, and it's hard. I know it's hard to sort of absorb some of this stuff because it's a lot, and we're going to dive in further. So, all right. Talking about the long range transportation plan after I have a sip of my tea.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a similar diagram to what we saw at the very beginning. And I'm not going to dive into this, but as we said earlier, the long range plan is kind of the big picture piece of our planning process here. We're looking at over a 20 or 20 plus year horizon, looking at our goals, objectives, and vision for the region in the future. and we do major updates to that every 5 years. And it provides sort of the universe of projects for us. So from the long range plan, we derive our priorities for the state 10-year plan, which then trickle down into what projects appear in our TIP. So the current update of the plan, this is an interim update, and we're focused and not a full update. So we're focused on that 2-year update that we talked about earlier, focusing on making sure that our project list is updated and the fiscal analysis is reflecting current assumptions, that our project timing is consistent between the TIP and the long range plan. And that we're sort of striving to sort of further incorporate the performance-based planning requirements that Federal Highways has added to our things to do over the last several years. And then sort of we will be completing for the next cycle a full update of the long range plan. So we'll be looking at our goals, objectives, vision, big picture stuff, as well as the project list and that kind of thing. So, and that's scheduled to be completed essentially 2 years from now. But we'll be starting that well ahead of time. And Scott, if you want to chime in at any point along here, just do so, okay? So the current update.
I was going to say a bit about the future update later.
Okay, awesome. So the current update that we're working on, as I said, we're focused on maintaining that consistency between the TIP and the plan and making sure that our project listing and fiscal constraint analysis reflects the current assumptions in the TIP. Essentially, this is a duplicate of the last slide. I'm not sure why I included that. So long range projects. So when we talking specifically about the projects there, we've got about 88 projects in our long range plan, plus another 45-ish that are in the TIP. We touch on all surface modes, highway, transit, bike, pedestrian. We include in that estimates of future spending on the transit systems, the turnpike, and programmatics. And total cost of projects in there is about $1.5 billion over the next from now out till 2045. That does include 2.8% inflation per year in expected costs. So we can break that down into sort of components. And how I like to do it is looking at the TIP, although I forgot to update the header on this. That should say 2021 to 24. So the first 4 years, we have about $257 million in projects. And again, these are estimates and rounded numbers. In the out years of the 10-year plan, so the last 6 years of the 10-year plan, which is actually should be 25 to 30. Again, forgot to update the header. We have about another $300 million in projects estimated, again, over those 6 years. And then in the remaining part of the 10-year plan, which should say 2031 to 2045, we have just about $1 billion worth of projects. And these are, again, when we talk about turnpike projects, that's expected amounts of spending based on historic patterns and a sort of a share of resources. So again, these are 15 years of compounded spending on statewide programs and turnpike projects and transit. So, those are substantial amounts of money when you add what's being spent on a yearly basis and, for 15 years. And then in terms of individual, projects for the region, we have about $350 million worth of project in those out years. And these range from very small projects to multi-million-dollar, kind of tens of millions of dollars type projects.
I've got a question, David.
Certainly.
What's happening in the auto industry is we're going to electric vehicles in a big way. By 2045, the amount of money that we get from taxes of fuel is going to go down a lot. What's being done about that? Because that's what funds a lot of this.
Yeah, I mean, that's decisions that are made on a higher pay grade than me.
I'm just curious.
Congress, essentially that's going to be governed by Congress and the president, and decisions that are made probably at the state level to some degree in terms of what to do with state fuel taxes and how to deal with that, and vehicle registrations and how those things are funded, but also at the federal level. The federal gas tax hasn't been raised since the early 90s. So we've been dealing with sort of losses in funding capability on that for 30 years now. And so, that's going to have to be addressed. We do make the assumption that we're going to see revenues sort of at least as much as on an annual basis as we're seeing now, and if not growing slightly. And I think in the plan itself, I dig into the details about, what the assumptions are about growth and revenue. But roughly, I sort of assume a modest growth in revenue, because we have seen that over the past 20 years. We've seen pretty consistently a 1% to 2% per year increase in federal funding. And so I sort of assume maybe on the low end of that for that purpose. And, again, these are all, because we're talking about future assumptions, these are all fairly general and subject to revision every cycle. But I try to be a little conservative so that we're not sort of over promising. It's still a lot of money, and we have the capacity to probably add some projects. But I don't want to be, assuming that we can just build everything that we think we want to build,
Okay.
So when we look at the programming of projects, this is just sort of a graph of projects by year. So again, the first 4 years here are the TIP. I sort of color coded these, the statewide projects, which are fairly consistent across the board. And that's basically because we're making an assumption about a percentage of total state revenues that are going to these projects each year. And it just increases a little bit each year. And it's fairly consistent. On the transit side of things, we sort of have the similar sort of assumption that there's a certain amount of funding coming that increases slightly each year. So we see a little bit of growth there. When we get to turnpike projects, you can see that this reflects what's programmed in the TIP and the 10-year plan. So in the first 4 years here, we have some substantial turnpike investment. And then in years 5 and 6, it starts to tail off. And then in the last 4 years of the 10-year plan, we actually have nothing programmed at this point for the turnpikes. But then for going forward in future years, we sort of make the assumption that a certain amount of turnpike improvement money is going to come to the region, as well as money for preservation and maintenance type work, that's all going to come in. And it's a small amount that is sort of consistently applied. The final piece of this in the orange is our regional projects. And so we see what's programmed in the TIP in the first 4 years in orange there. And then again, the remainder of the 10-year plan. So we have a lot of funding programmed in the first 6 years of the 10-year plan, including the 4 years of the TIP. And then in the outer 4 years of the 10-year plan, we sort of tail off a little bit as some of our larger projects in the region are sort of processed through and finished out. And then going forward from beyond the 10-year plan out to 2045, this is basically the programming of our projects that we have already listed. And basically, we have to make sure that we're fiscally constrained by year. So I programmed our projects by basically the prioritization that we did for the 10-year plan, took all the projects and applied the prioritization to that. So if a project had a higher score, it tended to get programmed earlier on in the outer years. So basically, it just took all our projects and kind of spread them out over those 15 years as best I could to make sure that we were fiscally constrained on a year-to-year basis. So I've talked about some of these assumptions that we make in that fiscal constraint analysis. Our estimate of revenues is based on an agreed to methodology that's consistent between the 4 MPOs in the state as well as with DOT. Our funding in the TIP and in the 10-year plan is equal to our regional share. So whatever is listed in the, even if our share in the outer years might be less, if we've got more money programmed in the TIP for the region, that's our assumption about what our funding is for that year. So that on those TIP and 10-year plan years, the programmed projects is equal to the amount of funding we expect to get. Beyond the 10-year plan, we expect to get about 22.5% of the turnpike improvement dollars, as well as about 13% of sort of the total federal resources coming into the region or into the state. We do assume revenues are roughly flat. I think I need to update that. I do assume a small amount of increase over time, but it's under 1%, I believe. And then we do inflate costs at 2.8% per year. And then any of the individual projects that are listed in our plan also include a 10% charge from NHDOT for indirects. So it adds up after a while. So basically, we need to make sure that for each year of the plan, our annual revenues or expected revenues are at least greater or at least equal to, if not greater than, the annual project costs. So, and that's where this graphic comes in. I've sort of color coded it. In the green is the tip, the orange is the remainder of the 10-year plan, and then the blue is the remainder of the long range plan. The black lines and then the purple lines are based on the expected amount of funding in the region for each year, and the bars represent the programming for those years. So you can see during the tip years and the 10-year plan years, the amount of programming that we have is equal to the amount of funding available to the region. Pretty simple assumption there. And that's due to the fact that the state programs projects statewide, they don't take into account regional boundaries when they're programming projects for the most time. So we assume that if the state is funding the project, then we have the revenues to fund it. Once we get out beyond the 10-year plan, that's where we start to get some differentiation between revenues available and revenues expected to be spent on projects. And you can see that every year we are expected to have at least the amount of revenues we need to fund these projects. And in some cases we have some gaps, which means there's capacity there for some funding and mostly in the outer years. And probably with some tweaking of the numbers, in terms of when projects are programmed, I could probably get some of the earlier years to line up a little more closely with the amount of revenues expected, which would increase the gaps in the outer years. But again, this is all sort of a fairly rough estimate. I'm going to let maybe Scott take over at this point and talk about some of the updates to the text and the narrative and the plan that have occurred.
That's great. Thanks, Dave. As Dave said at the outset, typically for these interim updates, the focus is really just on updating the long-range project list, updating fiscal constraint. But we have made a few supplemental changes to the narrative of the plan that we wanted to summarize quickly. The first of those really has to do with COVID-19. And this has been a pretty odd year. COVID has certainly had significant impacts on the transportation system. We haven't addressed these in a comprehensive way in the existing conditions and future trends chapters. And that's in part because of the minor nature of the update, in part because of data limitations, and in part because we're still in this and don't yet have a clear sense of what the medium and long-term implications will be for the transportation system. But what we did do is add kind of a one-page summary in chapter 1 at the end of chapter 1, just giving an overview of the sorts of impacts that COVID has had on the transportation system in terms of significant increases in telecommuting and consequent decreases in vehicle miles traveled, impacts on transit, impacts on housing market and in migration even. Another element that's in chapter 1 is just summarizing the merger between CART and MTA, such that references throughout the document to CART are now to CART and MTA. In chapter 2, we're getting your Outlook, Dave, or not your Outlook, your File Explorer. In chapter 2, I've updated the project prioritization process information that we had. In 2020, the 9 regional planning commissions jointly agreed on an updated set of project selection and evaluation criteria. And through the TAC, we updated the scoring and weighting for each of those. And so there's an updated section describing that revised process. Also, some new information about performance measures, including the performance measure that we're introducing on multimodal network connectivity coming out of the bicycle level of traffic stress study that we worked on with the other MPOs in 2019 and 2020. In chapter 3 and 4, there are a number of project updates where there were references to projects being about to happen that may have subsequently been completed. Examples of those are the Hampton branch. When this plan was last updated, the state hadn't yet been able to acquire the Hampton to Portsmouth section of the Hampton branch rail line. So there's an update related to that. There's an update on the status of Commute Smart Seacoast, the Regional Transportation Management Association. The pilot funding for Commute Smart ended in June of 2020, and that's now being managed jointly by RPC and SRPC. So there's some information there. Have updated information about pandemic impacts on transit ridership and some of the demographic data. In chapter 4, some other project updates, there was reference to the Hampton intermodal study from a few years ago and what the prospects were for a new park and ride facility at the south end of 95. Last year, C&J opened a new facility in Seabrook. And so that discussion is updated. Similarly, the discussion of the Sarah Mildred Long Bridge, which has since been completed, and the General Sullivan Bridge, we updated. And then an update to national stats on transit funding is in there. So that's the summary for the plan update narrative. Can we go to the next slide? Not sure if I can control that. A few remaining things. So the system performance report has been updated for the TIP. We need to expand that for the full time frame of the plan itself, and then continue to check the project info and fiscal constraint data for accuracy. And then the next. And Dave referenced up front that while this is a minor update, our next update, which we need to adopt about 2 years from now, will be a comprehensive update to the plan. So we want to go back and have a fairly significant public input process. We'll be revisiting plan goals, objectives, policies. In terms of public input, we're actually looking to begin that probably late this calendar year, going out, meeting either individually with municipal staff or perhaps in small groups of 2 to 3 communities that may share local and sub-regional needs. Doing a regional survey of some variety. We had inquired with UNH Survey Center about the cost of actually doing a telephone survey, such as we did for the regional master plan update and the last full update to the long range transportation plan. The costs of those have gone up substantially, as I think they now have a much harder time reaching people on the phone. More people just let numbers they don't recognize go to their voicemail. So those costs have gone up, but we have the really useful publicinputs.com tool. And we think that while using that wouldn't necessarily be a full random sample, if we distribute the link widely enough through all of the communities, that we can get some very good information on a survey of that sort where people would respond by choice. We'd be looking to do outreach at community events. You know, certainly in the past, we've tended to hold forums and hope that people come to those forums. What we've been starting to do in the last couple of years is going to community events where people are already gathered and see if we can catch them there to give us some input. Whether that's farmers markets or old home days or other local festivals. And then doing a series of focus group meetings. I see you, Danya. question?
Yeah, just a suggestion in terms of how to further access the community for their input. I'm not
Yep.
sure if you're aware, there is an application and it's incredibly robust. It's called Next Door, and it represents the community, I would say about 7 to 8, I'm not exactly sure, of the communities within Rockingham County. And I would suggest you just take a look at it. And it has a wide display of different information. And in fact, it is a great way, I believe, from just having watched the growth of this Nextdoor application, that this would be very relevant for the way to try to disseminate information and particularly assess and ask for, or at least to share the link so that you can ask the community to give input. It's just a thought.
Thank you. I'll look into that. I mean, I think yeah, we'll certainly look into that. We're also thinking, getting link posted on community Facebook pages, whether formal town pages or informal kind of community discussion forums. And it sounds like that has a similar focus. So I'm interested to see that. When we did the last update in conjunction with the regional master plan update, we also did a series of focus groups with older adults, with individuals with disabilities, some modal groups like freight shippers, transit operators, bicycle and pedestrian advocates. And we anticipate doing that as part of this as well. So, and then we would do another round of project solicitation, likely in summer 2022. So that is sort of the preview of the next full update. And then I think last slide here, at least last slide on the plan. So our recommended action is adoption of the 2019 through 2022 Transportation Improvement Program and the 2045 plan. Recommendation to the Policy Committee by the TAC of adoption of those documents. And as Dave summarized earlier, the TIP and the plan are fiscally constrained. We feel that they reflect regional priorities. Transportation conformity has been addressed. And we feel that the project listings in both the TIP and the plan make progress towards achieving our performance targets and our regional goals as they're lined out in the plan. So are there comments or questions at this point? And then I think at this point where you would be ready to do a roll call, or do you want to hold the roll call until we're talking about the 10-year plan priorities as well, Dave? Dave and Richard.
Yeah, I think we'll do the roll call now because the TIP and the plan are sort of a separate piece from the 10-year plan in this case. And we're sort of looking to get those documents adopted. So
David,
yeah.
Do you want any questions now, David?
Absolutely. I see Chris is raising, Chris Jacobs.
Chris?
Yeah, thank you. My concern is that I continually see the state adding more and more infrastructure, and this kind of builds on something that Bob Landman said earlier. When you, and it's more of a comment of our federal and state legislators, in that we build this infrastructure and then we fail to properly recognize what it's going to take to maintain that infrastructure. For instance, scraping down steel structures and repainting them. And that, because I'm dealing with the same thing here in this community, and I imagine in all communities, sorry, in that they tell you this is what the pot of money is, yet it doesn't actually correspond to what the need is, to what the obligation is. I look at the new improvements, if you will, the general Sullivan Bridge area, And just to get to the malls area, we put in a whole nother bridge or set of bridges, huge off ramps. And when I see that new bridge going up, I'm going, okay, so they just added another bridge to the bridge list. Are they also 20 years out, 10 years out, 50 years out, planning what it's going to cost to get underneath and let's say scrape the steel and repaint it, or resurface the bridge deck, or do a bridge decking? So my question is the planning dollars that you're seeing get in there, and in particular, I remember the bar graph, you had a very dark blue but very small section across that was almost from year to year the same amount. When we keep constructing more and more complex infrastructure, the new bridge in Portsmouth, I want to say it's it's the one they named after the councilor, Portsmouth City Councilor. That's going to be a more expensive bridge to maintain in the future than the one it even replaced. So how can we realistically, if you're going out 45 years, keep that number exactly the same, or as a percentage of the same? It can't be. But I understand why you did it. It's because it's a fiscal constraint analysis, not a needs analysis. Do we get the proper information? Do you get the proper information you need from New Hampshire Department of Transportation to say, these are the dollars that it's going to take to maintain the infrastructure going forward in the future? You know, I'm almost inclined at this point not to vote for the TIP or either one of these documents, because they don't realistically portray what we're trying to do, even remotely.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the TIP for sure reflects DOT's expected maintenance and preservation work over the next 4 years. Beyond that, it's essentially a guess on my part, based on current expenditures and basically you're right, a slight growth in current expenditures. What we've seen over the last 3 or 4 TIP cycles is more and more of the money that from the feds and being pushed into these statewide programmatics, which are essentially maintenance and preservation work for the large part. And so we are seeing more and more of the funding go in that direction sort of every year. So I think DOT is well aware that they don't have enough to maybe maintain and keep the system where they would like it to be. And we saw that, I don't know if you remember from a few years back, DOT talking about their bridge strategy and their pavement strategy, where bridges, the idea was you fix the worst first. And on the pavement side of it was you keep the good roads good and don't worry so much about the really bad roads. And so some road that's in terrible shape, DOT can repave it 5 or 6 or 10 times for the same cost as it would take to rehabilitate and fix the underlying issues on a particular road, that kind of thing. So, DOT is putting a lot more money into paving, a lot more money into bridge maintenance. Going forward, I absolutely agree that this is an issue. We're certainly seeing a shift in the types of projects that are put forward. We've had a lot of very large projects in our region in the last few years addressing some of the maintenance deficiencies of the 80s and 90s, essentially dealing with the Memorial Bridge, the Sarah Long Bridge, the Newington Dover General Sullivan Bridge, this Hampton Seabrook. All of those are, needs based on problematic maintenance during the 80s and the 90s.
Because they didn't do their job in the 80s and 90s. We're having to pay the preacher now.
Yeah. And so now at the very least, when DOT is designing a new bridge, they're building in life cycle costs. So they're whether or not that money gets translated into the maintenance budget on a year-to-year basis, but when they design a bridge, they're designing it for 75 or 100 years. And they're saying, here's the construction cost. Here's what it's going to cost to maintain it on a year-to-year basis. And, so they're at least planning for that. do we accurately represent that in our plan? I don't know. It's a struggle to sort of pull all those different numbers together. DOT does their budgeting maybe a year or two out. So we're basing everything on a very short window of the future. But they also do in the 10-year plan, they commit to saying, okay, we've identified all these red list bridges that need to be addressed over the scope of the 10-year plan, and we have the money to address them. So I know on those pieces, they're talking about those things, they're thinking about those things. Whether we sort of accurately represent that in our long range plan, that's a question. And it's something that we'd love to sort of be able to dive deeper into. But I think as I started to say and then got sidetracked myself was, we're seeing a shift from all these large infrastructure projects, I-93 widening, these big bridges, to much smaller focused projects addressing system deficiencies, things like the 101 Route 1 interchange, which is, a way out of whack design there that needs to be updated. So we're seeing that's, in the future, that may be the largest project in our region, and that's a $7 or $8 million project. So going forward, I would expect we'll see a lot of those more sort of targeted projects addressing bottlenecks or system deficiencies in particular locations without the large widenings and the expansion of the infrastructure. Although on the other hand, we may see an expansion in bike pedestrian infrastructure, transit infrastructure in the region as trying to catch up to where the roads are.
So David,
you recognize the issue then. That's
Could I just interject, Chris? I just want to reiterate what Dave said there is that DOT certainly has their themes through the 10-year plan process and, meeting with legislature and all that, talks about the importance of preservation and maintenance and the cost. And, if there's, everyone knows there's not enough revenue to do all the thing, but that is certainly one of their key elements is that we need to preserve and maintain what we have, because in long term, if you don't do, as you're aware, if you don't do those things, then it costs long. So I will certainly take this message back and share it with others. So I do appreciate your comments.
Yep. I asked years ago when the lady that was the commissioner of transportation, this was about 8 years ago, and they were going to replace the Sullivan Bridge. And I said, so what's the maintenance budget going to be? Because the steel bridge, you're going to build another steel bridge. And is it going to end up? And then she said, no, there won't be a dollar accounted for. We don't have a budget for maintenance of steel bridges. And that's what you've got to have, or they rust away and they become hazardous to navigation and you build a new bridge. But she admitted they wouldn't. They had no idea. They weren't going to do anything about it. They don't have, you're building a brand new bridge and we have no maintenance budget.
Yep.
You can't do it that way.
I think it was a lot longer ago than 8 years, Bob.
Yeah. Paul, go ahead.
Paul, yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to jump in and recognize that through federal rulemaking and working with individual states, and specifically here in New Hampshire, in recent years, DOT has put together a transportation asset management plan, which really looks at all of the assets, chronicles the assets, looks at their conditions, and considers their life cycle. As you mentioned earlier, Dave, life cycle, cost analysis, and the financial plan that is outlaid in the transportation asset management plan is one that looks at those individual assets and provides estimates for how much funding is going to be needed to keep those assets in acceptable condition. So, Chris, you raise a really good point. That's very, very important. You've got to consider when you're building new infrastructure, how are we going to pay when it comes time to improve the condition. And I guess I would rely on they call it the TAMP, Transportation Asset Management Plan, but I guess I would rely on the TAMP and DOT's reliance also on their knowledge of what the condition of those assets are. And the TAMP is revisited annually. DOT puts work into the TAMP, updating information, and then sends that to Federal Highway for our review. And it gives us an opportunity to ask questions and to prod when we think more information is necessary. That taken together with the pavement condition, bridge condition, basically the rulemaking that talked about performance measures, when you bring all of that together, I think what we're ending up with is a much more comprehensive picture of taking care of what's out there now and not overextending, trying not to overextend the needs that are going to come along in the next few years when your budget's not going to be able to keep up with that. So I think you raise a great question, and I think there are some safeguards in place. And that's not to say, like I think Lucy mentioned, someone mentioned, you're not going to be able to do everything that you want to do, but at least it's a plan and it lays out timeframes for when certain work can get done. So they're planning for those costs into the future. So that's being thought of.
Right. Thanks, Paul. I'll dig that out of the DOT's website and attach a link to the email with the project updates memo and that kind of stuff that I'll send out after the meeting. So if you want to take a look at DOT's plan, transportation asset management plan, you absolutely can. So, and we do try to be consistent and incorporate that as best we can. But it's a challenge. So it is 10:30. So I think we've got to sort of press on here a little bit so that we can get the 10-year plan prioritization piece done as well before we finish up. So I think if there are no more really pressing questions,
Danya does have her hand up.
I see. Yeah, I see, Danya, you have your hand up.
No, you've answered the question, so you can ignore me.
All right.
Press on.
Dave, I've had my hand up here for quite a bit. I don't know if you can see me or not. Ken Latchaw.
Oh, sorry, Ken. Yeah, no, you're not showing your video. So,
hold on here. All right.
Keep your hand up.
Here we go.
Oh, there we are.
I'm sorry. That question. Excuse me.
Yep. Go ahead, Ken.
Question. Okay, my question. I have two. First, a comment. I've lost my signal quite a bit for the last two gentlemen that were speaking. I lost about 3/4 of what was said, but my first question is, did I hear that the General Sullivan Bridge is going through a revision to what was possibly partially agreed to years ago? And then the second question with the TIP projects. We have one slated for Ps. My question is, because there's such a limited amount of revenue, the Ps Development Authority does very well. How come or why aren't they participating to do work at Ps? Thank you.
Shall I say something about General Sullivan?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So obviously the highway bridges are done at this point. And so the question is about bicycle and pedestrian access and what happens with the historic General Sullivan Bridge, which is really heavily deteriorated. And I think at the time of the environmental impact statement, they thought that historic resource could be rehabilitated. And my understanding is that subsequent bridge inspections have found that the deterioration has just progressed a lot faster than they thought. And so part of this analysis is looking at life cycle costs as just described. And while they could repair that existing truss structure, the long-term maintenance costs are very high. And so one of the considerations in the proposal to remove the old layers of plate steel and rivets that are part of that truss structure and replace it with a new steel structure on the old footings is to create that that connection, but with a much more stable, a bridge that would require much less maintenance over the long term. And so they're in negotiation with the Division of Historic Resources to ensure they can get that permitted. Does that answer your question, Ken?
Yes, but the gentleman, I think two back, was talking about never having enough money here in New Hampshire to do maintenance on bridges. Now, when we go back to when they were talking about the General Sullivan Bridge and whether or not it could be rehabbed or totally replaced. Since that date, there's really been no maintenance whatsoever done to the bridge. So it has continued to fail over the years. So my concern goes back to what the gentleman said is we have these projects, but I'm concerned about being able to maintain them once they're addressed, because you need the maintenance money, and there doesn't seem to ever be enough to do that.
Yep. I mean,
Well,
that's-
I know that
Go ahead,
the
Paul.
maintenance concern
Is
is
that
a
what I
big
was talking
part of
about?
the discussion of next steps.
Say again.
Paul, and you were talking, Scott.
I was saying the long-term maintenance is a major part of the discussion of next steps on that project.
Okay, Paul.
And I was saying that, Ken, there's a document that is now required for each DOT to put together called the Transportation Asset Management Plan. That's a federal requirement. And I was talking about what does that document really do? In that document, the state outlines its assets, and bridges are definitely a part of that, roadways, all sorts of assets. And the document looks at those individual assets, considers their current conditions, and projects condition into the future so that the financial plan, which is part of that asset management plan, can predict and set aside money to update and keep the condition of those assets in good condition. So it's a planning document. It's looking at the assets in the state, transportation assets, and it's a way for the DOT to know what their future costs are going to be for maintenance. And knowing that, it allows the DOT to set aside funding in their planning to meet those needs. And so I was saying also, together with the performance management, the performance measures that are being looked at, the performance of, let's say, bridges and highways are considered every 2 years. Targets are set for the condition of those assets. And then it's like a report card. We look at, okay, here were our targets 2 years ago. Now, 2 years into the future, did we meet those targets by actual data that is collected on the condition of those targets? And so I was saying that taking the process that is that transportation asset management plan together with the performance measures that are reviewed annually, but reported on every 2 years, those two steps together help the DOT greatly in looking at the current condition of their assets and then helping them to plan for the costs that are going to be required to bring those assets into good condition or to keep them in good condition. So I was trying to outline that process that's in place now, and it's a relatively new process, but I think DOT has done their own version of this for some time. I think now it's become more formalized at the federal level.
Just a thought.
Question, Ken? Did that answer your question, Ken?
Yes, and I had that one other question about Pease and whether or not the Pease Development Authority participates with revenue sharing, I guess, for lack of a better term, for work on Pease, or are they not part of the solution?
So the two projects that are on Pease, they will provide matching funds for that, I believe. But those are mostly federal funded, but there is a local match requirement that I believe they are covering. They are also handling a lot of the engineering work on those, so that pays for some of it as well. Yeah, it's an interesting situation with Pease. They're a major employment center for the region, so we want to make sure that the transportation system works well there and facilitates movement to and from and through. But yeah, I understand there's some complexities with the Newington and Portsmouth, and the surrounding communities. So, they are part of this process. They are a member of our technical advisory committee. They're not here today, and they are a member of our MPO. So they are involved in the regional process as well.
So we can move along. Are there any other questions?
Just wanted a brief one. About 11 years ago, I was up in Minnesota and on business, and we were driving down towards New Orleans, and we came to the Minneapolis Bridge. It was gone. It fell down. It fell down the day before we'd have crossed it, and could have died. And so I hope that Fed is looking at bridges like that, and they have changed their because they just let it go.
Yep.
And it fell apart, and it literally fell apart, and people died.
Yeah. So every bridge in the state is inspected annually, I believe. And if it's on the red list, it's inspected more frequently than that even, or maybe it's the red list is inspected annually. Other bridges are inspected every other year. So there's pretty regular look at the bridges. It's a pretty substantial piece of the state budget is to do those bridge inspections, and to make sure that if there are problems, and that's not just the state bridges, that's local bridges as well. So, that if there are problems that they are made aware of and put into the queue for improvements. We've had in some cases bridges closed. We had the Memorial Bridge closed for a little while back before they rebuilt it because it was decided it wasn't safe to put traffic on it. So, we know that the DOT is willing to do that and will do that if the situation demands it.
Well, we had
Lucy.
I was just gonna say my wife is selectman years ago. The Cedar Road, Cedar Road, I think it's called, by the shopping center. It was so bad that the post office couldn't drive over it, fire trucks couldn't drive over it, and we tried to get the money. We tried to get the state to fix it, and they wouldn't do it. And one day I said to my wife, "Well, who owns the roads leading up to the bridge?" And the road agent said, "Well, we do." I said, "Well, then why don't you get some Jersey barriers and simply put them on our roads and see what happens?" Well, the next day, the Hampton Union had a big article because people started bitching about, "Hey, we take that road, now we can't go through there." And they came up with the $60,000 to fix it.
So, I know there's a lot of conversation that's happening here, but I've got one more item to get through still.
Go ahead. Sorry, David.
So, and about 20 minutes to do it. I do, however, need a motion and a second to recommend approval of the 21 to 24 TIP and the 24 to 5 plan update to the MPO Policy Committee.
So moved.
Second, Brad Nichols.
Juliet made the motion. Brad, you second?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Brad second.
All right, I'm going to go through my list then, and I'm going to make the assumption that there's no more conversation that needs to happen around that. And go through the list of folks and get a yes or no on that. So Bob Landman.
Yes.
Juliet Walker.
Yes.
Yes. All right, Mark Connors. Did we lose Mark? All right.
I think he had to leave.
Okay. Chris Jacobs.
Yes.
Yes. Richard McDermott.
Yes, sir.
Tim White.
Yes.
Lucy St. John.
I abstain.
Abstain. All right. All right. I'm going to skip our federal highways folks as they're non-voting. Matt Scruton.
Yes.
All right. Danya Siegley.
Yes.
All right. Rad Nichols.
Yes.
All right. Peter Coffin.
Yes.
You Ken Latchaw.
Yes.
All right. Beverly Cray.
Yes.
All right. Thanks, Beverly. Tim Moore.
Yes.
All right. Did I miss anybody? No, not hearing anybody speak up. All right. Thank you very much. All right. I am going to, we'll move right on to talking about our 10-year plan priorities. And I'm going to share my screen again. Maybe. All right. So 10-year plan project prioritization. This is the last piece that we need to spend a bunch of time on today, and maybe not so much of as a bunch as probably 15 minutes. So I'm going to rip right through this as best as we can. So we've talked a lot about the 10-year plan and the TIP and the plan today. It's again, that's the state-driven cycle. We are sort of, as I said, maybe near the beginning, we're sort of at the combination of step 10 of the existing 2021 to 2030 plan and step 1 of the development of the 2023 to 32 10-year plan. So kind of we're focused right now, we're going to talk about our project identification prioritization for the 10-year plan. We started this back in the last summer with a solicitation of projects to the communities and our transit agencies and others. And in the fall, we set the project selection process and the criteria weights for how we were going to score projects. And then in also sort of late in the fall, in September and October, we set our draft priorities and developed a short list of projects or a candidate project list for DOT. Those were submitted in early November, and DOT reviewed them over this winter. We had a conversation with DOT in sort of late in January, where they presented what their results of their engineering and cost review was. And so now we're at the point where we're here in February, we're trying to finalize our list of priorities or priority for the 10-year plan and submit that to DOT by the end of March. And then from that, DOT will start to pull together the draft 10-year plan. So just a little bit on our guidance. That we received from DOT. So in terms of adding projects to the 10-year plan, the construction phases are likely in the last 2 years of the 10-year plan. Engineering and right-of-way may be programmed ahead of that. Our target funding for the region for the 2 years is just under $6.7 million. We do have to include the inflation at 2.8% per year, as well as that indirect costs. And that's basically DOT's cost to administer and deal with these projects on an ongoing basis. We have the common set of project selection criteria that all the different RPCs are using, as well as DOT. And we had to go through the engineering or cost review prior to be adding to the 10-year plan. We chose to have NHDOT do that. We could also hire private consultant engineers to do that work as well. For that, we could submit projects up to our budget target of that $6.7 million plus 2 additional for review. And that's what we did. And DOT has committed to adding our prioritized projects to the 10-year plan as presented. But however, all the projects in the 10-year plan have to go through the GASSET process, which is inherently political and inherently ends up with some projects being removed or moved around, or new projects added that we haven't even talked about. So there's a lot of changes that can occur during that political process. So when we did our selection process for the 10-year plan, we looked at a number of things. We first looked at eligibility and feasibility. Is a project eligible for federal funding, and how feasible is the proposal? We did some initial scoring, or we used those project selection criteria that I mentioned before back in the fall, and weighted them and organized and listed the projects by priority. And from that, we created that short list of projects to send to DOT for review. And it ended up being 5 projects this round. And from that, we will develop our priorities and which, we're going to talk today about what the recommendations are, and then we'll put that forward to the policy committee for next month, where hopefully they approve our recommendations. So when we started, we were talking about 127 projects in our long range plan, out of which 73 were sort of potentially eligible and ready to maybe be in the 10-year plan. And we broke those into 3 groups of projects based on the scale. So we looked at local projects, we looked at regional projects, and we looked at interregional projects. And those are entirely based on the expected scale of the project itself, as well as the benefits and scope of those benefits. We shortlisted 5 projects from each of those 3 into these 15 short lists that we talked about at a TAC meeting in September. And from that, we set 5 projects to be sent to DOT for that engineering review. And we're at this point today where we're hoping to come up with what our final priorities are. So these are the 5 projects that we sent to DOT. And this was the the list that I presented at TAC back in September. So the top project was the East Coast Greenway, which I've shortened to ECG here, which is the rail trail. That's this phase 3 of that project. That was the top scoring project based on the project selection criteria. And that's completing that section of rail trail over the Hampton March in Hampton and Hampton Falls. It's about a $5.5 million project. That's our initial estimate on that. Second ranked, another project is 125 project in Epping at the 125 and 155 intersection there, which was addressing safe access to that major regional corridor. We knew at the time that this project was probably very substantially underestimated in terms of costs, and when you see the next slide, you'll see that was in fact the case. Portsmouth Bartlett Street Bridge. This was a red list bridge in the city of Portsmouth, hoping to get addressed as part of this as well. Next project was Raymond. This was the intersection of Route 27 and 156. This is a congested intersection on a community that hasn't had a 10-year plan project in a while, so that floated to the top. And then in Northampton, the US 1 Route 111 intersection or Atlantic Avenue intersection. This is just a small bottleneck on that northern section of Route 1 in Northampton, and there's some bike and pedestrian crossing issues there. So we submitted those, and then when we heard back from DOT, here's sort of a summary of what we heard back. The memo that I sent out included this information as well. East Coast Greenway, they felt that the estimate was appropriate and seemed reasonable. They did have some concerns about the potential environmental needs for that section of corridor, being that the project is in a basically a giant wetland marsh. And so there are some concerns with tidal flow and things like that they felt might be challenges for that project. And there's also an access across a private right of way, which I believe Scott understands the details of that. So maybe it isn't quite as much of an issue as it was thought. But anyways, that's still a $5.5 million project. Epping project, they had said that while a capacity analysis indicates that there's some delay there, it's not clear that the site actually meets warrants for a traffic signal. And so that would need to be completed. The cost on that went up substantially, as sort of I anticipated it would. Portsmouth, the Bartlett Street Bridge, DOT did not feel they had enough information to make any sort of informed estimate or have a real discussion about that project. And that led to some discussions during our meeting with DOT about, one of those chicken and egg kind of things where if they had let me know that they didn't have enough information, maybe I could have found and provided that information working with the city. So, but going forward, we'll be trying to address those issues so that those don't happen again. The Raymond intersection, they were concerned regarding the purpose and need for that and whether it was truly needed. There's also a substantial amount of development in close proximity to that intersection, and they were concerned about the impacts there leading and driving up right-of-way costs. Costs on that went up about 50%, so a pretty substantial increase on that as well. Northampton, that US 1 111 intersection, the narrow right-of-way there was the large concern. And so that kind of drove that and the based on what was in the Route 1 corridor study drove the cost of that up. And so that's now estimated to be about a $5 million project to address that. Instead of $8 million, $8.5 million that we submitted, it's about a $14 million worth of projects. So the gist of that is that we are essentially, in a position where we can fund a single large project or maybe a couple of smaller projects. I would say a couple of these projects are maybe not eligible to move forward. The Bartlett Street Bridge, for instance, DOT recommended that the city apply again to the state aid bridge program for that to try to address that one. And then, maybe with some additional scope and work that might be able to provide some assistance there. So based on that information, my recommendation or staff recommendation is that we fund our top ranked project and we fund a single project this year. In previous years, we've sort of had to make this same sort of decision whether we fund a single big project or multiple smaller projects. And we've often gone with the multiple smaller projects. I think in this case, the benefits of of this project and the fact that it really allows us to complete the Seacoast, the East Coast Greenway, really are driving factors here. I think there are a lot of benefits, and I'll let Scott maybe share some additional thoughts on what the benefits of that project are. The additional recommendation that I'd have on this, and this is something we discussed at our meeting with DOT, was taking the sort of the remaining share of our regional target and essentially adding it to this project to sort of pad the engineering and construction costs a little bit to better be able to absorb any sort of unexpected environmental or historic resources costs and things like that. So Scott, do you want to add anything on the benefits of that project?
Yeah, sure. I'd just note that this has been identified as a regional priority since 2008. This was put forward by the town of Hampton Falls, but actually includes work in Hampton Falls and Hampton. This would go from the Seabrook town line through the entire section of Hampton Falls and then into the southern part of Hampton, terminating at Drakeside Road. And then the trail as a whole affects 7 Seacoast communities between Seabrook and Portsmouth, and most of those communities submitted letters of support for Hampton Falls project here. So the benefits for the trail as a whole include a safer transportation facility for walking and biking as an alternative to doing that along Route 1 to get within and between communities, a recreation facility. Based on a couple of studies, we think that this has significant potential to be an economic catalyst for the southern Route 1 corridor communities. And also the way the design, the conceptual design is now, we think it has the potential to also contribute to marsh restoration. There was a conceptual design study with the UNH engineering department a number of years ago that recognized interests of several different state agencies in the marsh there. DOT, Division of Historic Resources. There are 3 historic railroad bridges there that have been found eligible for the National Register. And then also the DES Wetlands Bureau is concerned about tidal flow. Right now, tidal flow is pretty heavily constrained through 3 very narrow bridge openings. And this design would open up 3 different areas that have currently been overwashed at high tide and replace those with stretches of boardwalk and significantly improve tidal flow. So those are the reasons that we feel that it's a very good project and worth considering as a single project to fund. Along the lines of DOT's comments, I noted the environmental and historic resource challenges. The private right-of-way is Brimmer Lane in Hampton Falls, although according to the right-of-way information we have from Boston and Maine Railroad, there is an easement for railroad passage across that road. Brimmer Lane used to travel on a bridge over the railroad. When the railroad stopped operating, that was replaced with just a solid embankment. And I think that the cost estimate here includes installation of a large box culvert so that the trail could pass underneath Brimmer Lane.
All right, thank you, Scott.
Question, Scott, the Seabrook nuclear, is that get open to get through the back of that to continue the trail? Or after
my understanding is that the most recent conversations the Seabrook Trails Group and folks from the town have had with Seabrook Station is that they are now amenable to the trail passing across the station property on the DOT right-of-way on the rail line itself, as long as there is fencing put up on either side of the trail to keep people on the trail.
Great, good, thanks.
I saw that Chris Jacobs had raised his hand.
Oh, okay, I can't see. Chris?
Yeah, thank you. I guess I'm mystified as to why I can't say as I agree with this decision. Let me tell you why. For years, we've all traveled up 125 with 155, and there's been some major accidents at that intersection and deaths. And how a project like this, which isn't going to improve anybody's safety, and I understand it's a, you know, and I'm a cyclist, 500, 700 miles a year. I don't think this is the proper way to go. I think that when the bridge over Hampton Harbor is done, the Neil Underwood Bridge, there'll be a safe mode for bicyclists to get from Hampton to Seabrook to wherever. The alternative is also the Route 1 bridge passing. That could be made safer, certainly for a lot less than $5 million. And in light of what, and this gets back to my comment earlier, we put forth projects that then have other issues like maintenance. Sea level rise is, you know, everybody's got an opinion on it, but I regularly see this whole railroad track. It's not constrained by the 3 bridge crossings. The whole railroad track is submerged in water. So the tide has no problem getting over the railroad track. I just don't, unless there's a more concerned plan, overall plan for what's going to happen in Hampton, and then what would happen at the other end as far as, if you will, this economic development benefit. I just see this as very premature, and that the other projects that were on the list, the project in Raymond, they have far more safety ramifications, benefits, if you will. They have far more economic benefits. I don't see why we're running with this particular project. And I say that because, you know, I'm still not getting a firm commitment from the elected officials and the management of the town that this is the way they want to go. I did submit, in an effort to push this project forward, the last month's memorandum that came out and identified all the places where we're going to access this, because I want the selectmen to buy into this. I want them to back it, but I just see my vote will be no, because this is premature. It's probably another 3 years, whatever, but I don't see that at this time. Thank you for letting me
I mean, the points are well taken. Let me respond to a couple of them. In terms of sea level rise, the point I didn't note is that the other aspect of this design is to elevate the causeway 2 to 3 feet. The current width of the existing causeway is great enough that you can have slope and elevate that. I believe it's 3 feet, consistent with the recommendations of the Coastal Risks and Hazards Commission. So there would be the opening of those 3 significant washout areas. You're right that if you walk that causeway along much of it, you can see places where during major storms, you know, tidal rack has gone up and over on a regular basis, though, and with king tides, there are 3 washout areas where the tide is going over on a regular basis, and those are those 3 areas that are proposed for further removal of material and replacement with boardwalk, and the cost of that is worked into this estimate that was originally developed by the UNH engineering department and has been reviewed by another professional engineer and now by DOT. Hampton did submit a letter of support for the project. Jamie Sullivan, the new town manager, did. Certainly there are issues to work out. I know there are some at Department of Environmental Services that have advocated for just removing that causeway altogether. I think that the other agencies with responsibility for the causeway, DOT wanting to see it used or at least and preserved for a transportation purpose, and Division of Historic Resources having an interest in the historic resources there. So that will need to be a conversation and a permitting process. The economic impact study I was referring to is one that was commissioned by Unitil a number of years ago. Was not commissioned with the idea of supporting the rail trail. They hired an economic development consultant to look at a range of projects that would have the potential to serve as economic catalysts for the Southern Route 1 corridor, Seabrook, Hampton, Hampton Falls. And the rail trail was actually the top project that the consultant recommended, having potential to assist with economic development. And there are a range of economic development studies that have been done for rail trails around the country that I can point you to.
I hear what you're saying, Scott. With respect to the Unitil study, let's keep in mind they have a major electrical transmission line right next to it. It would be in their best interest to have the federal government or somebody else pay for a road bed that then they could maintain and work from on their electrical lines. I take some humor with Unitil doing that kind of economic study. It almost like is the coffee industry telling you that coffee is good for you on a daily basis because it helps with your productivity. So, you know, it's like, I seem to be using the phrase a lot. It's like calling the kettle black, the kettle calling the pot black. So I just.
Fair enough. Those actually aren't Unitil's lines. Those belong to National Grid, which is part of our
the
source.
National Grid, but let's get National Grid. If National Grid wants to pay $2 million towards this $5 million cost, I'll vote for it because they're going to benefit from it more than the number of cyclists. But when you look at $5 million into the number of cyclists that are going to use this versus the value of one life, again, lost somewhere else at one of these other transportation, it does not, you know, I hold it up to the light. It doesn't pass the test for me. And I'll be not voting against the project, but against it being, when weighed against all the other projects in the tip that, you know, or that need to come forward, this is not the project nor the time. It's premature by a couple of years.
So, you know, just this wouldn't be programmed for construction until 2031 or 2032. So, that, you know, it is still a little ways out. Engineering would be programmed ahead of that to try to address and deal with these environmental issues and other issues like that. I think my concerns on the Raymond project are twofold. One, the scope and sort of need for that project is unclear. It was a project that came to us via, so when Raymond switched over from Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission to Rockingham Planning Commission, that was a project that was in the long range, the Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission long range plan for Raymond. It got sort of ported to ours. When I reached out to Raymond this fall to ask about the project and what they might be interested in there, I heard nothing back from them. But it did go to it kind of met, you know, under the project selection criteria, it kind of floated to the top and it was near the top. But I would say the question is, you know, whether or not there is a major safety issue there or not. I think that's unclear. And I think whether the congestion there is something that's solvable with a reasonable scoped project is also a little bit questionable. The 125 project, you know, I think DOT's concerns on that were basically they're not sure if it meets warrants for a signal or if even a signal is the best approach there. Both of those things could be dealt with during the design. I have heard some rumblings of another 125 corridor study that would look at that northern portion of the corridor again and sort of update. There was a study done in 2008, sort of updating that information, and that might, if that happens, that would be, you know, a great way to sort of facilitate that project moving forward. DOT is also doing work currently on 125 between 101 essentially and Route 87, try to address capacity and safety issues along that section of the corridor. So they are looking at that corridor, and it's certainly up there still. But those, for me, those are sort of the reasons why holding off on that project for both of those projects.
Okay.
And
Juliet has her hand up, Dave.
Yep, I see Juliet. Okay.
Thanks. I actually, I hope we move this question, but I just want to chime in and say that I absolutely support having this as a region's top priority project. I think there are benefits beyond safety, although I think it has safety benefits. And I think one of the critical parts of it is that it is truly a regional project. I think as a regional planning entity and a group that advises the MPO on how to expend funds and support expenditure of state and federal funds. This is federal. The other thing that's attached to is that this is attached to CMAQ funds that we have an obligation to spend on a specific project. We can't just take this funding and put it towards another project, even if we wanted to, which I don't think we do. And I think there's strong regional support. Each of the communities has actually supported this project. And I do think it makes a lot of sense for this to be a regional priority. So while respectfully, I understand each person has their opinions, as somebody who's been involved with this project regionally and seen all the advocacy and discussion that's gone around it and bringing it to this point and seeing the state support for it as well, I think it absolutely needs to remain the region's top priority project. So I would support that.
All right. Thank you.
I would second Juliet's motion.
All right. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Tanya. All right. So I guess if I could just keep moving forward then, because we're after 11.
Go ahead.
So getting to sort of this question, what happens to the projects that don't get into the 10-year plan this round? Well, they don't go away. They are still in our long range plan. They'll be considered for future 10-year plan cycles. And as we do our next full update of our long range plan, we're going to try to dive into the details of some of these projects and make sure that they are still desired by the communities and that there is a legitimate scope and purpose and need for each of them. So in addition, projects that are in our long range plan there is a benefit if you're going after transportation alternatives funding or CMAQ funding. Some of the times the criteria that the state looks at in terms of deciding which are priorities, they look to see if those projects are included in regional long range plans. So it's helpful. Going forward, we'll also be looking at doing some regional safety and congestion analysis and other, bike and pedestrian safety analysis to try to develop further project ideas. Some of those may overlap with existing sites and some of them may be new. And so we're hoping to get some additional backing information for some of these sites where we're sort of questionable, like this site in Raymond or in Epping, where we think there's probably a need there. It's been identified on the local level at least, but having some regional analysis to back that up would be helpful going forward. There's also a quarter study program that DOT is implementing where we'll submit our priorities. We have 4 priorities that we've identified for that program. We aren't quite sure if or how or when any of these will get funded, but Route 33, the entirety of Route 33 is a priority, as well as 111 on the western part of our region from where 125 over to Salem and Wyndham in that area. 125, and there's a gap between the quarter study that was done from Epping to Rochester and a quarter study that was done Plasto to Kingston. There was a gap in Brentwood and Kingston that sort of missed that we'd like to see addressed. And then we also want to take a look at the 101 interchanges and all those unsignalized interchanges and see how they're functioning. In addition, if DOT puts forward a quarter study for that northern portion of 125 from sort of Epping north, we would certainly be supportive of that and going forward. So we'll remind
Matt Scruton, I'll make that motion.
I'll second it.
All right, thank you, Matt and Bob.
Thank you.
I'll open it up maybe is there any further discussion?
Just one comment, and that Juliet pointed out and thank you, Juliet, for doing it, that these are CMAQ dollars and can't be spent for anything else. So in the greater good, it probably does deserve a vote of approval, because otherwise, nothing else will.
Right.
It needs to expend the CMAQ money. So
yeah.
My comments before stand, but at the same time, as she pointed out.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll just clarify that. The other portions of this project, the phase 1 and phase 2, have been funded to some degree with, I think, CMAQ money. This is just sort of listed as federal funds at this point, and it would be 100% federal funded, but it's not. We don't know exactly what the source is yet. That'll be sort of determined at a later date.
Understood.
All right. Okay, so if there's no other questions or comments, I'm going to run through the roll for hopefully the last time. I'm going to stop my share. Okay, so Bob Lamon.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you, Bob. Juliet Walker.
Aye.
All right, I think Mark Connors had to leave, right? So
You left.
Chris Jacobs.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Richard McDermott.
Aye, aye.
All right, Tim White. Is Tim still with us? Nope, guess not. Lucy St. John.
I abstain.
I thought maybe you might.
Right.
Paul is non-voting. Matt Scruton.
Aye.
Aye, thank you, Matt. Danya.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Rad. Rad still with us? All right, thank you, Rad. Peter Coffin.
Yes.
All right, thank you, Peter. Ken Latchaw.
Yes.
All right, thank you, Ken. Beverly Cray.
Yes.
All right, thanks. Tim Moore.
Yes.
Okay, I think that is everyone. Did I miss anybody who's a voting member? All right, I guess not. So lost a few people along the way here. All right, thank you. That concludes the motion and the things that we need to get approved. I know Scott has a quick update related to project updates that I'll let him do. I will be sending a memo out after this meeting along with a link to the DOT's Transportation Asset Management Plan and a link to the presentations that I gave. So those will be sent out as soon after the meeting as I can pull all that information together. So I'll let Scott take over and then we can call it a day. And thank you for sticking with us on this long meeting.
Yeah, Scott.
Great. Just quickly, the Transportation Alternatives Program, we received from DOT information on all of the letters of interest that were submitted statewide. For that, I think statewide, I believe it was 43 projects requesting about $29 million for a 2-year pool that is about $5.4 million. There were 4 projects from communities in the RPC region. There was one from Portsmouth, one from Newington, one from Rye, and one from Salem. The next step in the process is there's actually a mandatory pre-proposal meeting for applicants this coming Wednesday, March 3rd. And then full proposals will be due later in the spring. But there are some very good projects. I will send out the additional project information that we have rather than going through that now, given the time.
Okay. Any other questions?
No, I just add, if anybody has any questions on anything that we talked about today or anything that's in the project updates list that we'll be sending out, feel free to reach out to Scott or myself, and we're happy to talk about any of this stuff. So thanks for coming today.
Thank you folks for attending. The meeting is adjourned.
All right. Thank you, Richard. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good day.
All right. Take care, Richard.
David, quick question.
Sure.
The RPC statewide page, Raymond was not capitalized.
Uh-oh. All right. I will look at that.
That's important, Dave.
Yeah, it is.
It jumped right over the top left corner. First thing read. Oh, shoot.
All right.
Thanks,
I will take a look at that.
Be good.
All right. Yes, you too. All right. We'll talk to you later.